This tutorial will cover 2D animations for sprites and UI. A lot of times games will have a heads-up display that has some animated elements right when the game launches or when the level starts. These animations are to help draw the player's attention to the user interface. To create some user interface elements in Unity, we'll go to Game Object, UI, and I'm going to start actually with a slider. And you'll see why in a minute, but I'm going to use this to be the health. And when you create a UI element, it creates this canvas object. And this canvas is how Unity renders the user interface. The canvas is rendered by a different camera. So our camera in the scene is way down here, way far away. The canvas is this great big object that is not lined up with the camera, and that is because it is rendered separately. So I'm going to move this slider so it's sort of in the middle and so we can see where it's at. The slider in Unity, its default behavior is that you have this handle that you can drag and slide the slider bar up or down. And this is usually used for settings or options, like if you wanted to change the graphics settings or the volume. But it's really convenient to use it for something like health or mana. And it has this value down here. And when I'm dragging this value, you can see it's filling up the slider. And you can turn off the handle, first of all. So that's down here under the handle slide area, the handle object. If we turn that off, now we can see, it might be easier to see in here, we can see there's a fill bar and a background bar. I'm going to change the color of those so it's a little bit more clear. So when the fill is all the way at the bottom, that will be when the health is low. So I'm going to make sort of a dark reddish color for the background. And then for the fill color, the color that's filling in when the health is full, that's down here under fill area, the fill object. I'm going to change this to bright green. So this is the health, how much health the player has. And with the slider selected, now you can slide the value up and down and see what it looks like as the player loses health. So as I was saying at the beginning, at the start of a game or at the start of a level, a lot of times you'll see the health bar fill up from 0, and that's to draw the player's attention to the health bar. So that's one of the animations that we're going to do. Now you might notice when I have it all the way filled up, this does not fill all the way to the edge. The default normally would have the handle area there. So to fix that, if we go to the fill area, we can see it has left 5 and right 15. This is how much buffer area there is. And we actually want those to be the same. So I'm going to change right to 5. And now you can see that it fills the entire area. So now with my slider selected, when I adjust the value from 0 up to 1, you can see the health bar fills up. And that's what we want. So I'm going to, first of all, bind this to the bottom left corner of the screen. So UI elements always have a part of the screen that they're bound to, so that when the screen resolution changes, the UI elements can update appropriately. And this is a really important thing to do if you might be using this on different sizes of screens or different aspect ratios or different resolutions. And you can't really guarantee what kind of screen the user will be using, so it's helpful to set things up properly. So I'm going to bind this to the lower left-hand corner. That's what these little dots are. It shows you where it's going to be bound to. And so now in my scene, you can see, here you can see what the difference is. This shows you what your object is bound to. By default, it's in the center, so you can see that there. And if you set that to the bottom left, now everything that I do, I'm going to bind to the bottom left so that it will all stay together. So I'm going to have a health bar and a mana bar. So I'll go ahead and put both of those in there now. And I'm going to use a slider for both of them. So I'll just go ahead and duplicate, Control D to duplicate, and move this health bar down. This one will be the mana. So I'm going to change my fill area for the mana to be blue. Mana is always, well, generally blue. And the mana bar has the same behavior, how it will go from 0 to 1. And so we can see both of those are working. So now we're going to animate those. So I'm going to create a new animation. And I'm going to call this first one health. And so I'll select my health slider, the green one. And to attach this animation, I'm just going to drag it down right under where it says add component. And now it has created an animator component attached to this object. And the animator component basically links this object to the animation. So now if I go to Window, Animation, and add property, I can see these are the different things that I can do animations on. And the one that I want to animate is, I'm going to animate on the slider. I'm going to animate the value. So I'll hit this plus button here to animate the value. And so what I want to do is animate from a value of 0 to a value of 1. And so I'm going to start with this keyframe here at the beginning. And so if you drag your red line all the way to 0 and select this keyframe so it turns blue, now you're editing this keyframe. So I'll make that 0. And now if I drag along the timeline, you can see that filling up. An important thing to do when you're animating something that's going to happen at the start of a scene is you may want to make some buffer time at the beginning. So I don't want this to start right as soon as the scene loads. I want to give a fraction of a second of buffer time. So it will stay stationary and then it will fill up. And let's have a look and see how that looks. All right. So now I'm going to do the same thing for the mana bar, and sometimes it's nice to have them not fill at the exact same time so your eyes can distinguish them apart. So I'm going to create a second animation so it'll be offset a little bit. And I'll call this one mana, and select my second slider and drag the mana animation right under add component. Then in my animation window, I'll once again add property, slider, and then value. And I'll set this one to 0 at the start. And similarly, it fills up all the way. So I'm going to drag this starting keyframe. I want it to be offset a little bit from the health animation. So I'm going to have them start slightly different times. And I also want them to go actually at slightly different speeds. So I'm going to have this one end just a tiny bit later, but this is also going to be a faster animation, so it won't animate at the exact same speed as the health. This will just draw a little bit more distinction between them. All right, so that looks pretty good for the health and mana bar. Another thing that a lot of games have in the UI is a character icon here next to the health and mana bar. And to bring in a character, you'll want to bring in a sprite. And if you want it to be animated, you'll use a sprite sheet. A sprite sheet has multiple of the same image with different stages. So here you can see this is the character I'm going to use. It has her eyes closed in one frame and her eyes open in another frame. And then in Unity, what we'll do is we'll slice up the sprite sheet. A sprite sheet might have 2 images, or it might have 10 or 30. You can get pretty intense with your sprite animations. And if you are not comfortable making your own, you can find some free ones online. But if you are interested in doing 2D art at all, it is helpful to know how to make sprite sheets. One thing to note if you are doing it on your own is to make sure that the character that you are animating is always in the center of what would be the frame of that sprite. And that can be a difficult thing to do, but if it's offset at all, then what happens when the sprite animation runs is you'll see your character flicker a little bit side to side. So I'm going to bring that into Unity, and I'm just going to drag it in and drop it into my assets folder. And to make it into a sprite, we'll switch our texture type from default to Sprite, 2D, and UI. So this can be used as a UI element or as a regular 2D sprite animation. And we're going to set the sprite mode to multiple. This will allow us to slice the sprite. And I'm going to hit Sprite Editor and apply those initial changes. And so here's the Sprite Editor where I can slice the sprite. And under the slice menu, the default is automatic, but we want to change this to cell count. And here you can set how many columns and rows your sprite sheet has. Sprite sheets sometimes have rows of images that will go across and columns that will go up and down. Here I only have 2, so I have 1 row and 2 columns. If I had 2 more down here below, then I would have 2 rows and 2 columns. But for this example, I just have 1 row and 2 columns. And so those are the numbers that you'll set here. Set these numbers to whatever you need for your specific sprite sheet. And we'll go ahead and slice those. And now if I select it, you can see what that looks like. Now this is an opportunity where you can also crop the sprite if you want. So for this character, I don't want the whole character in my UI. I actually only want the head in my UI. So if you just drag the blue line from the bottom, make sure you get the blue line. There is also a green line, and that won't crop it for you. So we'll crop those and make sure they are cropped to the same distance. And when you close out of that, you'll hit apply. And now if you hit this little over arrow, you can see these are the 2 sprites that you have. So now I'm going to make another UI element. This is going to be an image. And once again, I'm going to bind it to the bottom left corner, just like my other UI elements. And for the source image of the sprite, I'm going to drag in this sprite that I just imported. And I'm going to set native size. And let's see how big that is. I might scale it up just a little bit, and that might make it a little bit blurry, but for this demonstration, I want it to be a little bit larger. Make sure that you create your images large enough in Photoshop for the thing that you're trying to use them for. So here I have my character, and in some games you'll actually have the character's icon go a little bit on top of the edge of your health and mana bar. And it might actually also be nice to put a little background image behind her. So I'm going to create one more UI image. And Unity actually has some defaults that you can use if you wanted to make like a background. And let's give that a purplish color. And anchor this to the bottom left as well. And here you can see it's going in front of my character, and I don't want that. To arrange what order things are rendered in a UI, you drag them up or down in the hierarchy. Things farther up in the hierarchy are farther to the back. All right, so now I have a nice little background image behind my character. And so now let's make the animation for our character. So I'm going to, once again, create a new animation. And I'm going to call this icon, because this is our character icon. And select our character, and then drag this animation right below Add Component. Then in the animation window, I'll add property, and this time I'm going to add a property for image and sprite. So here you can see this is the sprite image that is playing, and you can drag other sprites into the timeline. And if you hit play, you can see that animation happening. And that might be a little bit, well, the animation is not too fast, but what I want is for the eyes to stay open for more time than they spend closed. So I'm going to move this last keyframe down here. And now let's try that and see. Okay, so now she blinks and her eyes are open most of the time. So one thing that we want to be sure to do for an animation like this is to set it to loop. That will tell it to play this animation every time. Our health and mana, we don't want them to play every time. They just are going to play once. Now there's one more thing that UI element that goes into games a lot of times, and that would be a number for the health or the player level or the score. So I'm going to put a number up here, and we're going to animate that as well at the start of the scene. So I'm going to say this is maybe the player's level in the game. So I'll add a UI text object, and once again bind it to the bottom left of the screen. And let's position it so that it goes right next to the character. And let's say she is level 20. And I'm going to make this font size a little bit bigger so it's a little more readable. And I'm going to make this yellow. By the way, if the default Unity skybox is distracting or makes it difficult to see what you're doing, you can always change the skybox to a solid color and make that color darker so it's less, conflicts less with the things that we're working with. So I'm going to make that sort of a dark bluish green color so that it is not impacting what I'm working on. All right, so back to what I was doing with my level. So that she's at level 20, and I'm going to create another animation. This is once again just going to be something that plays at the start of the scene to draw the player's attention. So I'll call this animation level, and it's not going to loop because it's just going to play once at the start of the scene. So then I'll drag that onto my object and go to the animation window. And under the text, we can see the only things that we can add are color, enabled material, and raycast target. So we're actually going to instead animate something under the rect transform. And this is essentially what would be the transform component for a regular object. This is just the UI's version of it. And I'm going to do the scale. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to have it scale up in the middle. Let's try 1.5. And you can see what happens when I am scaling this, that it is animating from the middle, so it is moving the number over here. So you can see the number moves as it animates. And we don't want that, so a quick, easy way to fix that is to adjust the pivot of the object. This pivot here tells it where at in the UI component the pivot is going to be. So if you set this to 0 and change our view to pivot up here, when it's set to center, it will always view the center of the object. So adjust this to pivot, and then we can see if when this was at 0.5, it was in the center of it. And when I set this to 0, it is now on the edge. So now my animation will animate to the right instead of animating to the left. And it's going over a little bit on the other objects. So I'm also actually going to have the pivot from the bottom. So set the Y to 0 as well. And now the number goes up instead of down into the health and mana bars. I also want to reorder these a little bit. I don't like having the health and mana bar in front of this background image. So I'm going to take my background image and drag it in front of the health and mana bars. And I'm also going to drag the health and mana bars over a little bit and put them a little closer together. Also, a lot of times the mana bar will be a little bit smaller than the health bar once again, this to make them easy to distinguish, and also to create a little bit more interesting of a shape for the outline of all of this. All right, so that just about does it for sprite animations in the UI. There's one other way to do sprite animations, and that would be doing sprite animations in the game scene. And I'm just going to show that real fast. It's actually quite a bit easier. So I'm going to double click on my camera so I can go to where my camera is at in the scene. So this is my scene area here. And to make a sprite animation in the scene, you actually just drag your object. Here, I'm actually going to duplicate this, Control D to duplicate. And I'm going to edit this so that these are not cropped. So this is going to be my character in the scene. And so I don't actually want her to be cropped. I want her to be her full character size in the scene. So to create a sprite animation in the scene, you actually just drag your character sprite into the scene, and it'll prompt you to create a new animation. And I'm going to call this character anim. And by default, it probably runs too fast, but that actually immediately creates, oops, sorry, we gotta position it somewhere that the camera can see it. But that animation that it creates by default actually will automatically animate over our sprite sheet. And we can see it's quite a bit too fast. So I'm going to go to my animation window. And so this is the automatic sprite animation that it made for me. And you can toggle this down to see your images. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to make this a bit slower. And we only have one instance of each of the images. So I am also going to drag in the first image again so that this image, otherwise this image would only be on for one frame. So I want this to be on for several frames. And actually this one is with the eyes open, so I want that one to be on longer than with the eyes closed. How many frames are here? This is how long this sprite will stay active for. So this sprite with the eyes closed will stay for the first 8, and then the eyes open will stay, let's do it, about twice as long. And just to show as an example, we could have a different animation for this as well. I'm going to do an explosion. So I'm going to remove this character. And so once again, we will change this from default to Sprite 2D and UI, set it to multiple, and go to the Sprite editor. And so this one has rows instead of columns. So I will slice by cell count. Columns will be 1 and rows will be 3. And we can see that these are actually not all the same size. So we will need to adjust these. We want the frame to go fully around each of the sprites. And when we were making this in Photoshop, if we had made sure to center each of these sprites into what would be their frame, then we wouldn't have to make these adjustments. But we can make these adjustments in Unity if we need to. All right, so now each of these frames goes fully around that object. And so once again, I'm just going to drag it into the scene, and it will automatically attempt to create an animation for me. Call that explosion. Let's make sure it is visible to our camera. And I'm going to scale it up a little bit so we can see it better. And now let's play that. And it is looping, and it is also too fast. So I don't want this to loop. So I'm going to find my explosion animation and uncheck the box for loop. And then I'm going to go to my animation window with that selected. And first of all, I can see they're actually in the wrong order, so you can rearrange them here as well. So I want the smallest one first. And let's hit play and see what that looks like. So now it's actually a little bit too slow, so I want each of them to last for about 2 frames. It's a little bit hard to see because it's still looping in the preview version. But what we can do here also is have it disappear when it's done. And to do that, what we do is under the Sprite renderer, where is it? So we can do the color, and we can change our alpha at the end. And we want this to be just on the last frame, but we can set our alpha to 0. And so right now it's actually going to fade out. And so instead of having it fade out, I'm going to drag my color frame and drag that to the second to last. Oops. Sorry, it's hard to see when it's this far open. So I actually need the alpha keyframe. I think I dragged the blue. We'll go ahead and drag each of these over. So these are the color keyframes. So we don't want to mess with the keyframes for the sprite. So now let's see what that looks like. And the last frame on that looked a little bit too fast. Let's go back and see that. All right, so I am going to, oh, I see. Yeah, so we want the alpha to last full 2 frames. Oh, and we also want to remove this keyframe for the sprite. We want it to stay at the large size. And, oh, we lost our alpha. So I'm going to put the alpha to 0 at this keyframe right here. And I also want to add a little bit of a delay. So I'm going to move these over a little bit. And I'm actually going to have the alpha at 0 from the beginning. And so then on the first frame, I will have that set to 1. Or the second frame, sorry. So now it will be invisible for the first couple of frames. Actually, I'm going to drag, if you drag in this area here, you can select multiple frames at once. I'm going to move all of them over so that I have this little bit of buffer time here before the animation starts. All right, now let's try that and see how that looks. I'm going to add a buffer to this so that it actually plays after the UI animation. So I want my UI animation to play fully before this explosion. This explosion could be something that's happening in the scene from like the character spawning into wherever they're going to start. And I would want that to play after the UI is fully animated. All right, so that covers animation in the UI as well as sprite animation in the scene. So as a refresher, you can animate UI elements, you can animate them with a sprite sheet, or you can animate the different properties. For example, the value of the sliders for the health and mana bar, or the size and the color for the level. Or you can animate the sprite sheet in the UI, like we did with the character icon. And you can also animate sprites in the scene by dragging your sprite sheet directly into the scene and creating an animation that way. So those are the two main different ways of making 2D animations in Unity.